Siphamandla Zondi now joins us. Prof, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. I first want your views on what you just heard.
Good evening and good evening to listeners and good evening to the whole of Africa. It's a shame. It is really a shame that the ZANU-PF government has still not learned from the many opportunities that have been offered to it to learn about how to deal with disgruntlement, how to deal with an open political system, and how to not descend to levels that led to mediation coming into Zimbabwe to assist Zimbabwe just to play normal politics. It's just terrible that it confirms the fears all along that ZANU-PF was intent on a single-party state or de facto, and that it is steaming rolling in that direction, and that now with the military sharing the power together with the civilians in government, and the military hand, it's very visible now, because the only way the military understand how to deal with dissent is to clobber people, is to kill people, is to do the kind of barbaric thing we have seen, which really shames everybody and makes the cause for reforming Zimbabwe, for normalizing things in Zimbabwe, for growing its economy, for its fully participate in the world even more difficult. How to convince those who have sanctions against Zimbabwe to withdraw them when a state acts like this against unarmed citizens? Bad.
I have a bit of chills just looking at some of the visuals, Professor Zondi. And also, this is our neighbor. We're speaking about our neighbor. We're speaking about a neighbor to a country whose constitution is constantly being celebrated as one of the best constitutions. We're speaking about a neighbor whose neighbor is a country where journalists, where professors like yourself can be critical of the government. And yet, right across the Limpopo River, there is a government on the other side that is legislating dissent and saying that we are not going to accept dissent, we are not going to accept voices that want to criticize the government, and we will arrest those people. How do we speak about a democracy when it is quite clear that this is authoritarian rule?
It is sad, because Zimbabwe is born out of a very protracted process of fighting for liberation. One of the basic meanings of liberation is the freedom of people to take destiny in their own hands. What is being done here reverses all the gains of the liberation struggle. And that is an experience that the countries around it needs to remind Zimbabwe and say, this is not what we fought for. This is not a direction we should go. But under the current international system, unfortunately, there are limits to what you can do in another country, because international law prohibits you from interfering fully in the other countries. But you do need to send signals, and it does mean we may have to withdraw support for Zimbabwe's campaign to normalize its relationship with the world. It might also mean that we make it a lot more difficult for Zimbabwe to receive assistance from us, from Botswana, from Mozambique, and other countries around it. It's just not acceptable. The least we can do is to convey our unhappiness to them, privately or publicly, it doesn't matter, but we have to convey our unhappiness that this is the way that will take them back to 2008, when things got to a situation where SADC had to intervene as a body.
Then what do we make then of the inaction of SADC, the African Union? At least we've heard from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia. At least there's that voice, but that voice is not actively in politics.
Yes, and then Ellen Johnson Sirleaf herself says that because it's not in government. Once they're in government, then they are kind of constrained by those protocols that require that South Africa must consult with Mozambique, consult with Namibia, consult with Angola, consult with Zambia, Malawi, and the rest of the countries before it makes its point, because it doesn't want to isolate itself from the region. It wants to push a position that would be held collectively. Because if you push it alone, Zimbabwe can ignore you. Botswana learned it under Kama, that if you go alone, you completely ignore, like a loudmouth, you go nowhere. Mm-hmm. But in order to move somewhere is to do like we did in 2008, which is to convince SADC that we need to intervene in this situation and manage the situation. And Zimbabwe could not ignore it because it became a collective decision. I suspect they would do so because what Zimbabwe is going on violates, it really literally violates the agreements of the region and protocols in relation to democratic governance. It also violates the African Charter on democracy in a very clear way. And therefore, there's a clear reason why the continent and the region need to intervene. Unfortunately, in African regional diplomacy, there would be a process that could take a month or so before you get to the actual decision.
But what we've seen in regions like ECOWAS, that's not the case. They intervene. If they feel that there's a country within the group that is going to destabilize the region, they intervene. Why can't that happen here?
Yeah, it does happen in West Africa, but it never happens with a big country. Yeah. Even in West Africa. Yeah. West Africa has, we have seen situations where they've intervened, but it was countries that were a little weaker than the big countries. Mm-hmm. It took a long time for them to intervene in Burkina Faso. In fact, they never intervened in Burkina Faso in a real way. It is the people of Burkina Faso themselves who brought down the government there. They hardly intervened in Cote d'Ivoire. It was the French in the end who ended up doing it. It's a general African problem, but they intervened very quickly in Sao Tome and Principe. It's a very small island. Yeah. I think we would also intervene very quickly in Lesotho. There would have been somebody sent to Lesotho if this thing was happening in Lesotho. It's a small country. But when it comes to Zimbabwe, it comes to an Angola, comes to a Mozambique, we would want to first talk to a country.
Why is that the case? Why is that the case?
Pardon?
Why is that the case?
Because they can fight back. Because they can nullify whatever you do. Because they can counter-mobilize and isolate you. As Mandela learned in 1996 when he tried to act alone on the killing of the Agoni leader in Nigeria.
So in this case then, what do we then make of the silence of the region and the African Union, for instance, but you have international, countries outside of the continent that are condemning the actions of the Zimbabwean government? What's the biggest fear that could take place? What is that thing that could take place if the status quo remain?
There would be an open revolution. There would be a descent into violence. It might force the opposition in Zimbabwe to come an armed group, a rebel group of some form, which will make things a lot worse. This must be arrested very quickly because the patience of the people of Zimbabwe might just be at that level where they might escalate things to levels we've never seen before. So we have to hear the cry of Zimbabweans when they say, Zimbabwean lives matter. Indeed, they must. The least that could happen is that the ruling parties at least, but they're not encumbered by this governmental protocol. They should be issuing a statement. The ANC must have issued a statement. SWAPO must have issued a statement. Redimo, MPLI, they must issue a statement very quickly signaling that this is wrong. And then speak to their counterparts, ZANU-PF, and say, this is not a direction, this is not a democratic direction the struggle was about.
And this is all taking place while in the neighboring country, Mozambique, they're dealing with an insurgency of ISIS, and we are told that the modus operandi that's being used there is to target communities that are disgruntled. And here you have a situation where an entire country has citizens that are disgruntled. I'm not saying that all citizens are disgruntled, but you have a large number of citizens who are disgruntled. Does that leave the window open for an insurgency or even the supply of arms, for instance?
Yeah, there is ever possibility that even the insurgency that takes place in Mozambique might see an opportunity here and come into Zimbabwe to support whatever group is in there. It's not necessary to get to that level. Just if the ZANU-PF government would exercise really common sense in politics, which is have a conversation with people who don't agree with, maintain law and order in a normal way, but allow people to protest. It's just not acceptable that you would outlaw protest against your country, where your country then becomes a euphemism for not protesting against ZANU-PF. Terrible. It just doesn't work.
Just the final one, Prof. What does this mean then for South Africa? Because South Africa currently has millions and millions of Zimbabweans who live here, including some who are here illegally.
As the escalation happens, and of course as people start to protest, they will be beaten up, they will be harassed, they will have to cross the fences. They will cross the fences in 3 ways, as usual, they usually do, to South Africa, to Mozambique, to Botswana, and to some extent to Zambia. These countries, if they stay silent and not deal with this issue, they will still have to deal with the consequences of this, including the crossover of people who may be armed, who are disgruntled soldiers, and they come to fuel violent crime in all these neighboring countries. They have to act. It is in their interest because their own direct national security might be affected by what happens in Zimbabwe. So the actions of ZANU-PF may be harming regional security. And that is a good enough reason for them to step in, put diplomatic pressure, put all manner of pressure on them.
Thank you so much for that. That is Professor Siphamandla Zondi. Well, I have to wait and see how that one unfolds, considering the situation in Mozambique as well. Let's move over to this story.